to take a few minutes to share about my breastfeeding experiences and the personal lessons that I've learned along the way. So first, I'm Petra McEwen, a pediatrician, a lactation consultant, and breastfeeding medicine specialist, and I'm the owner of Mommy and Me Consulting, where I provide simple solutions for breastfeeding success. I have 5 amazing kids who I breastfed for a total of 50 months with over 4 years of breastfeeding. So I'll first start with my first daughter. When I had her, I was in my last year of undergrad at the University of Florida. I had very little exposure to breastfeeding, except from my sister-in-law who was breastfeeding my niece, who was born just a year earlier. I took a childbirth class, but didn't really know I needed to learn about breastfeeding. So I highly recommend, if you're pregnant, to take a prenatal breastfeeding class and to schedule a personal breastfeeding prenatal consult with a lactation consultant like me, so you know exactly what you need to do to prepare. I didn't even have the supplies I needed on hand when I had my first daughter. So with that first experience, we actually got off to a pretty decent start, but I didn't have a goal. I really didn't know what I wanted to do or set out to do. And I highly recommend that you do that. Just look at your situation, think about what you want to do as far as breastfeeding goes, whether you want to directly breastfeed or pump, if you plan to supplement or do a little bit of everything. Now, with my first daughter, I was also graduating from college and moving from Florida to Georgia for medical school. So there was a lot going on. So think about your life circumstances when you're making your breastfeeding plan, because it, of course, will make a huge difference. I lasted about 5 months of breastfeeding that time because I just couldn't keep up with it once I started medical school. But I did learn a lot that first time around. Now, baby number 2 was a completely different adventure because when I found out, because while I was pregnant, I found out that he had a heart condition and that he needed to have heart surgery right after he was born. So even though I was more prepared this second time around, nothing really can prepare you for having a baby in the cardiac ICU. So this time I added what I thought I needed for breastfeeding to my baby registry ahead of time. I still didn't meet with a lactation consultant though beforehand because I was busy with school. And that would have helped me to prepare a little bit more for this specific situation. But luckily I had amazing nurses and a lactation consultant at the hospital that got me set up with a hospital grade pump right after I had him, and I got pumping right away. I was able to store up my milk because he couldn't breastfeed for about 2 weeks after birth and after his surgery. And even when he did start feeding by mouth, I still had to keep pumping and couldn't feed him directly because the doctors wanted to know exactly how much he was taking in. And I also needed to fortify or add calories to my breast milk since he needed extra calories to heal and recover from his surgery. So we did directly nurse some eventually, but it was mostly a whole lot of pumping. And when I did go back to school in my med school rotations, I still didn't have a plan, which I know is key. Now, if you know you're going back to school or work, coming up with a plan ahead of time is important. After a few months, I eventually got so busy with my rotations and I got lazy with pumping, and my freezer stash that I built up early on really started dwindling. So we lasted a good 8 months, but my word of advice is that if you have to exclusively pump for your baby, to make sure that you keep pumping, because otherwise your stash or your supply will decrease, because breastfeeding is all about supply and demand. Now, baby number 3 was my residency baby. She was born during probably the busiest time of my life, where I was doing 30-hour shifts in the hospital at times. But I was more experienced, and luckily when I went back to work after I had her, she was in the daycare at the hospital where I did most of my rotations. And we really needed that because she was so attached and had a really hard time taking a bottle. I messed up with her though because I barely introduced the bottle when I was home with her because she nursed so well. So my advice is if you know you have to go back to work or school, to remember to introduce a bottle as soon as breastfeeding is established and you're in a good rhythm. This could be just a few weeks in. Offer the bottle at least once a day so that your baby stays familiar with it even though you continue to nurse. Her teachers at the daycare, it helped us to eventually find a bottle that worked for her, which leads me to my next bit of advice. If you're going back to work, make sure that you find a caretaker for your baby who fully supports breastfeeding. This made a huge difference for us. We still nursed strong when I was at home, and I just about had to force her to wean at 13 months. I do have to note that I was fortunate enough to be a part of a residency program that fully supported me through my pregnancy and throughout my breastfeeding journey. I could go downstairs to feed my daughter when I needed to, and I was also able to take pumping breaks when I could. My fellow pediatric residents covered for me a lot, and my attendings or my bosses, they were just super supportive of my needs. So 2 more words of advice are to build your support system early on and make it clear to those around you what your breastfeeding goals are so that they know how best to support you. Now, baby number 4 was born during my first job out of residency. I was still super busy, but definitely more prepared with all of the experiences that I had. One minor issue that she had was that she had a loud click when she nursed, which some people would assume is a sign of a tongue tie, but there was no sign of one in her mouth. She nursed really well, she gained weight well, and her clicking eventually stopped. So my advice on this one is to really just pay attention to your baby. Not all clicking is a tongue tie. Not all tongue ties need to be clicked if they aren't a functional problem. This time around, I struggled to keep up pumping because of my schedule. Just my work schedule was really busy, and I didn't have the support that I did during residency. We supplemented some, but still lasted a solid 12 months with her. Now, finally, baby number 5 was probably my most enjoyable breastfeeding experience, even though I did enjoy them all. I was older, more experienced with 4 kids in, I was 4 kids in, and 13 years from the first time that I breastfed. I was also now working at a practice that was the most accommodating for my breastfeeding needs. I checked all the boxes of advice I've given you so far. The biggest issue this time around was that he was so attached that I didn't find time to pump before I went back to work. I was always either holding or feeding him. So when I did go back to work, there was no freezer stash, and I was always only a day or 2 ahead of him. So another word of advice is to start pumping early, even just once a day, as early as day 5 after delivery. Store your milk and just don't overdo it because you don't want to get a painful oversupply. Now, even though I could barely put him down when I was with him, I did my best to snuggle with him and really just to enjoy those moments because I knew that it was likely my last time breastfeeding. He sadly weaned himself a little after a year. So my last piece of advice is honestly to just enjoy your journey. I know it's never easy, but think positive, think about all the good that comes from it. Even though you're exhausted, this time won't last forever. And believe it or not, you'll look back and miss it because I really do. So I do hope my story and these tips were helpful for you. Feel free to share this with any pregnant or breastfeeding moms you know. And remember that I'm here to be a resource whenever you need to. Just leave a comment or send me a message, and I'm here. Just reach out. Let me know how I can help with either personal consults or just tips, information for you. All right, take care until next time. Bye-bye.